One of the most fascinating things about studying history is realizing that governments across centuries often use the exact same language when they feel threatened. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. In 1775, King George issued what was officially called a Proclamation for Suppressing Rebellion and Sedition. It was Britain's formal declaration that the American colonies were no longer merely disgruntled subjects, they were rebels. And when you actually read the proclamation, the rhetoric is striking. The king declared that many of our subjects in diverse parts of our colonies and plantations in North America, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, had proceeded to engage in open and avowed rebellion. He accused them of attempting to establish an independent empire. Then he ordered all loyal subjects to use their utmost endeavors to withstand and suppress such rebellion and to disclose all traitorous conspiracies. Think about that language for a second. Dangerous and ill-designing men, traitorous conspiracies, open and avowed rebellion. Now, strip away the powdered wigs and the 18th century spelling, because this rhetoric sounds extremely familiar. In 2025, the White House issued NSPM-7, titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. Governments absolutely have the authority, and frankly, the obligation to prosecute actual crimes. But here's the constitutional and strategic question. At what point does a government stop prosecuting criminal conduct and start pathologizing political dissent itself? Because when you actually compare the 1775 declaration to NSPM-7, the similarities are not superficial. They are structural. King George described the unrest in America as part of a broader, organized, ideological conspiracy threatening lawful government. NSPM-7 does the exact same thing. This memorandum describes political violence not as an isolated criminal act, but as sophisticated, organized campaign designed to silence opposing speech, direct policy outcomes, and prevent the functioning of a democratic society. Again, some of the conduct described in the memorandum absolutely constitutes real criminal behavior. But notice how the memo moves beyond criminal acts and starts discussing broader ideological tendencies and cultural attitudes as indicators of extremism. The memorandum specifically identifies recurring motivations associated with so-called anti-fascism, including anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, hostility towards traditional American views, and support for violent revolution. That's not merely a criminal profile. That's an ideological profile. Look, let's be very clear here. Antifa does not exist as any kind of a centrally controlled organization at all. The fact that a federal policy is specifically directed at a supposed organization that doesn't even exist is a whole other set of issues and a whole other set of problems that we can talk about at a later date. What I want to focus on is something much larger historically. Because what Trump may not fully appreciate, almost certainly doesn't fully appreciate, is that he is potentially sowing the seeds of his own political destruction in the exact same way that King George III did in 1775. And this is the part that bothers me most personally, because I'm not approaching this primarily as a partisan. I'm approaching this as somebody whose professional background is in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency doctrine. I'm a former Navy SEAL and a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. I spent years studying how insurgencies form, how political violence escalates, how extremist movements recruit, and how governments accidentally make those problems worse. And one of the most dangerous things a government can do is begin treating broad categories of political dissent as a unified domestic enemy movement. Because historically, that approach very often creates the exact escalation dynamics it is supposedly trying to prevent. And that is what happened in British North America in 1775. At the beginning of the imperial crisis, colonial resistance was fragmented. Some people wanted reform. Some wanted greater autonomy. Some wanted reconciliation. Some wanted independence. There was no single unified revolutionary moment yet. But as the Crown increasingly framed resistance itself as sedition, conspiracy, and rebellion, it collapsed those distinctions together. And once the state starts treating reformers, radicals, critics, and dissidents as part of the same hostile ideological ecosystem, those groups often begin converging politically, whether they originally intended to or not. This is one of the oldest escalation patterns in counterinsurgency history. Heavy-handed state response frequently acts as a force multiplier for radicalization. And that's the part that I think modern governments consistently fail to understand. You do not defeat decentralized ideological movements merely by expanding surveillance authorities, broadening terrorism definitions, and rhetorically classifying opposition as an existential threat. In fact, those approaches generally strengthen the narrative of the extremists themselves. because it tends to validate their claim that the state is fundamentally hostile, repressive, and illegitimate. And frankly, that's what worries me most about NSPM-7. Not merely the civil liberties implications. I mean, those are very, very real, and we'll cover them some other time. What worries me even more is that it reflects a fundamentally flawed understanding of how political radicalization actually works. And NSPM-7 explicitly calls for a dramatic expansion of the investigative dragnet. The memorandum directs joint terrorism task forces not merely to investigate violent acts, but to investigate organizations, funders, associated networks, ideological radicalization pipelines, and entities that allegedly encourage or facilitate extremist activity. It even directs agencies to identify recurrent motivations and indicia common to organizations coordinating these acts. That is extraordinarily broad language. And historically, extraordinarily broad national security language almost always expands beyond its original target. And look, governments and institutions have always had a tendency to exaggerate the dangerousness of political opponents, sometimes sincerely, sometimes cynically, and sometimes just emotionally. Hell, there's at least one senior FBI official who has referred to me multiple times as a terrorist. But to be fair, she also happens to be my ex-wife. But all jokes aside, once institutions begin framing ideological opponents as existential threats rather than fellow citizens, constitutional protections start becoming conditional on political conformity. And Americans should be very careful about that. Because the American Revolution itself was, from the British perspective, an insurrection. The founders were, legally speaking, committing treason against the crown. That is precisely why this comparison matters. Every government facing internal instability becomes tempted to interpret dissent through a security lens rather than a political lens. And every government claims extraordinary powers are necessary to restore peace. King George said the colonists threatened lawful order and commerce. Modern governments, including the Trump administration, say extremists threaten democracy, national security, or constitutional institutions. Different century, same rhetoric. And this is where Americans need to understand the paradox at the heart of our constitutional tradition. We celebrate revolution in our founding mythology while simultaneously giving the government enormous tools to suppress dissent. The entire point of these constitutional protections is to ensure that political opposition does not become criminalized merely because it is disruptive, unpopular, inflammatory, or frightening. And historically, governments almost always overreach once they begin deploying national security rhetoric against domestic political movements. There was a time when the targets were abolitionists. There was a time when the targets were labor organizers. There was a time when the targets were civil rights activists. There was a time when the targets were anti-war protesters. And there was a time when the targets were right-wing demonstrators. The danger here is not merely one administration or one ideology. The danger is the precedent itself. Once a government begins approaching domestic political conflict primarily through counterterrorism frameworks, it risks transforming manageable political dissent into durable insurgent identity. And historically, governments that fail to distinguish between violent actors and broader political ecosystems often end up manufacturing the very instability that they supposedly fear. King George III did not preserve imperial unity by escalating the rhetoric of rebellion. In fact, he accelerated the collapse of British authority in the colonies, and on a longer timeline, probably throughout the entire British Empire. And history suggests that governments rarely learn this lesson for very long. One of the great ironies of American history is that our nation was founded by people whom the government of their time regarded as extremists, agitators, seditionists, and traitors. In that context, the very country born from resistance to imperial suppression must constantly decide how much dissent it is willing to tolerate within itself. And frankly, that tension never goes away. Not in 1775, not in 2025, not now, and probably never as long as humans yearn to breathe free.